Welcome, everybody, to episode 54 of Vassals of Kingsgrave's Agatha Christie Reread. My name is Bina007, and I will be your host for this episode covering The Clocks, an Hercule Poirot mystery originally published in November 1963. And today I am once again joined by Pat.
Hi there, 2.0 in the Discord.
And if you want to join the conversation, jump on the Discord server. If you go to our YouTube channel or WordPress, VOK podcast or Vassals of Kingsgrave, you'll find the link. Okay, so this book comes after The Mirror Cracked, published in November 62, and before Caribbean Mystery, published in November 64. So we're in that cadence of a Christie every year. And just to remind you, she's now in her early 70s. So it's really impressive. This is a standalone Hercule Poirot, as I said. And the concept of the novel, or the conceit, is that Poirot never actually visits any of the crime scenes or speaks to any of the witnesses or suspects. He's challenged to prove his claim that a crime can be solved by the exercise of the little grey cells alone. And it's also an unusual novel in the way it's written. So it's a little bit first-person narrative, but then also third-person. And there are two plots that are woven together. Basically, Poirot trying to solve this from his armchair, while the police are working on the spot with, I guess, what we discover is an underground person from British intelligence. So that's the kind of setup of the novel. And I guess the big narrative opening is that a body has been found, a man has been found murdered in the front lounge room of a blind lady who works at a photographer's. She's out when the murder is committed. And the weird thing is there's a whole bunch of clocks that have been left all around the room telling the same time, including one that is titled Rosemary. So that's the setup of the clocks. We have some Christie-verse stuff. So Poirot in chapter 14 refers again to one of his favorite cases, the one related in the Nemean Lion, which is part of the Labours of Hercules. And we also have a reference to the Girl Guide murder, which is really Dead Man's Folly. So, Pat, had you read this before? How would you rate this in the pantheon of Christies? Is this lesser Christie, better Christie? I mean, we're doing a full pod, so what did you think?
I hadn't read this before. I think Maurice Richardson of The Observer said that this is not as zestful as usual. Plenty of ingenuity about the timing, though. I would put this sort of mid-tier Christie, and I think it's probably one of her better post-war ones. I think one of the values in us doing it as a sort of a full pod rather than a mini pod is that it ties in with marking the social changes through Britain.
Yes.
I think this is quite an interesting document in that respect. And what I would say as well is I think I don't like this as much as some of the other Christies that I prefer, like the one that we always come back to is sort of like Death on the Nile as being like our high watermark for Christies. Well, this is not the same because the characterization for me is much poorer, but I do like the plotting, and I like the way that it's sort of the crime is solved at the end. I do think that's quite cleverly handled. So I think Agatha's done quite well here. I think part of her problem has been that she's such an old hand at this. You get the feeling like she could probably knock one of these things out on the aeroplane as she's flying somewhere. And like she's probably got 90% of it already written, and then she just finesses it and just churns it out to help keep the taxman happy. So she's got something to pay her annual tax bill with. So
it's a weird one. I feel that this is better than some of the more scathing reviews. And indeed, apparently there's evidence that she herself didn't think it was that good. I actually think it's better than most people think it is. But I would probably rank it a little bit below you. So I was leaning towards mini-pod until you said you wanted to talk about it. Partly because I think there are a few things in the plotting. It is a very good intricate plot, but I do think there are a few things, just coincidences, that rub me up the wrong way a little bit. But there are one or two things that I think are really fantastic and, you use the word zestful. I mean, the little bit where Poirot is comparing all the different detective novelists and their styles, I think is really brilliant. And then it actually comes useful in solving the plot. So I think there are these flashes of kind of peak or prime Agatha brilliance, and that lift it up from being, I think the podcast that we love to listen to, all about Agatha, had it in their bottom 10. And I think that's really, really harsh.
Yeah, I think it's sort of like to be an apologist for the podcast. I think what they always say is that they love all the Agathas anyway. It's just that some of them are so much better than others, and I think they always caveat that. So I think they were a little bit harsh on it as well, but I think they just have a genuine love for everything that's Agatha anyway, don't they? So
yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, well, you commented on the social change that we're documenting, and we are now in the 60s. I talked a lot about this in the Pale Horse mini pod about espresso machines and beatniks and, a world of constant roar and, home appliances. There's lots going on in these 16 novels. A couple of things jumped out to me, and then we'll see if you've got any others as well. So, eating in kitchens, not dining rooms. Here's a conversation or a bit of prose quote. I knew why that was. It was already, or close upon, the sacred hour of 1, an hour sanctified by English traditions to the consuming of a midday meal. In 1 or 2 houses, I could see through the uncurtained windows a group of 1 or 2 people round a dining table, but even that was exceedingly rare. Either the windows were discreetly screened with nylon netting as opposed to the once popular Nottingham lace, or, which was far more probable, anyone who was at home was eating in the modern kitchen, according to the custom of the 1960s. So no more eating in formal dining rooms. Made me laugh. And no more Nottingham lace.
Yeah, well, I think part of that is a reflection of where Christie is setting this, because it's not the same setting as a lot of her pre-war novels. We're not dealing with upper middle class. We've got a much more working class cast, and I thought that was quite interesting, because if we look at, like, there's this bit where the detectives are going around all the different houses on Wilbraham Crescent. And it was almost like you've got a cross section of British, a much more representative cross section of British society than you would have had in a lot of Christie's pre-war novels. Where you would have just been dealing with upper middle class or even like landed gentry. Whereas now we've got like the local builder, a retired maths professor.
And therefore it probably therefore has more value as a sort of social document, because this is how people really were living. I sometimes wonder what Agatha Christie would think of us now, grabbing a sandwich on the Boots meal deal to eat at one's desk at work, like not even taking a civilized 1 o'clock lunch. And then the other thing that jumped out at me is when the protagonist is saying, I would really want to have a gossipy old lady who was living on the Wilbraham Crescent who could tell me all the gossip, like a Miss Marple type. And this is what they say, quote, "What I wanted, what Hardcastle wanted, was some nice, gossipy, prying, peering old lady with time hanging heavy on her hands, always hoping to look out and see something scandalous. The trouble is that kind of old lady seems to have died out nowadays. They are all sitting grouped together in old ladies' homes, with every comfort for the aged, or crowding up hospitals where beds are needed urgently for the really sick. The lame and the halt and the old didn't live in their own houses anymore, attended by a faithful domestic or by some half-witted poor relation glad of a good home. It was a serious setback to criminal investigation." And I thought, my goodness, Agatha's in her early 70s. Maybe she's thinking of her own predicament, like, oh my God, are the kids going to put me in an old age home? Where can I find a half-witted relation who will come and take care of me? So brilliant.
I mean, there's definitely that, and it shows that she's still got that really sharp sense of humour that she deploys all too infrequently in her later works. But she's like definitely on the money.
This was very acute, very acute. Okay, so any other social change things you want to comment on?
Quite a few.
Okay,
Mainly it was just with the cast of characters. I thought it was just interesting to see the job descriptions. I mean, and even Colin Lamb. I think like this is the first time we've had a mention of marine biology as a career in literature, and I thought it's interesting how the characters before the war were these type of characters. Were amateurs, who just had an interest in it, and now here they are. They're actually professionals involved in it. Colin's done his degree in it, in marine biology, which is a surprisingly interesting subject. He keeps trying to tell us all the way through the book. So I think it was just really to do with that. I think we can talk about them more when we get to the cast of characters, but like the Cavendish Secretarial Bureau, again, I was suddenly looking at this going, this is the type of, I don't know if this job would have existed before the war. Maybe it did, but like now we've got this woman who's set up her own business, running the Cavendish Secretarial Bureau. So I thought that was all quite interesting.
Lady entrepreneurs, absolutely.
Yeah. The other one I noticed as well, and I think she was one of my favourite characters. I don't want to get too sidetracked on this, but I love Mrs. Hemmings, who again, it was like, I think this is a literary first of the crazy cat lady. She like got so many cats, and they're all running wild around the place. I thought that was brilliant as well. So just little things like that tickled me. But anyway, I think, like I said, we'll probably come back to the one we're talking about, the individual characters. So.
Absolutely.
One other one that I wanted to mention was the Browns. So Geraldine Brown with a broken leg. And I thought, because you were talking about not having Agatha bemoaning Agatha's detectives bemoaning the absence of nosy old ladies.
Yes.
But I was reading it and I just thought that this is just Rear Window. This just lifted this straight out of Rear Window. Here we've got this Geraldine Brown. She sat up with a broken leg, buying on all the neighbours, and and that's where the detectives get a lot of their information from. So I thought,
and Rear Window came out in 1954, so Agatha Christie would definitely be ripping it.
Yeah, she's definitely seen it. So.
Very much so. Okay, well, let's quickly run through the events that were going on in the world in the year running up to our contemporary readers, getting their Agatha Christie for Christmas. So in December 1962, David Lean's epic film Lawrence of Arabia premiered in London, one of my all-time favourite films. January 1963, French President Charles de Gaulle vetoes the UK's entry into the European Common Market. Scoundrelous. And Kim Philby defects to the Soviet Union. So I think pivotal to this book that we're in an era of heightened Cold War and Reds under the bed and spies defecting. May 1963, the Coca-Cola company introduces its first diet drink, Tab Cola, always featured in like funny comedies that are trying to immediately indicate they're set in the 60s. July 1963, zip codes are introduced by the US Postal Service. I was kind of trying to think when were postcodes introduced here. It feels like that's quite late in the day.
Yeah.
Yeah, don't you think? That feels like late. August 1963, the Great Train Robbery takes place in Buckinghamshire, England. Epic. Martin Luther King delivers his I Have a Dream speech on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial to an audience of at least 250,000, later contested by Donald Trump because he always gets the largest audiences. And 1963, John le Carré, in my view, one of the greatest ever spy novelists, publishes his breakout hit, The Spy Who Came In From the Cold. John le Carré himself, an ex-British spy. So again, this is an era of heightened Cold War tension and spy stories. November 1963, continuing on the civil rights theme, Malcolm X makes a historic speech in Detroit, Michigan, the message to the grassroots. We also get and Kennedy was shot, and you can listen to many Vassals of Kingsgrave's podcasts on that, which we never really finished that series. But if you ever want to know anything whatsoever about the Kennedy assassination, jump on the Discord channel titled Psycho Serial Killers and ask FT Ward, because he knows more. He's forgotten more about this than anyone else will ever know. And also, last but not least, in November 63, the British TV show Doctor Who premiered for the first time. So it's a strange moment, isn't it? It's space race, it's civil rights, it's spies. It's a weird time.
Yeah, it very exciting time, but also like a lot of very scary stuff happening as well. I've got some events then as well. I've been playing event bingo as you've been listing them off. So you've covered nearly all of them. But I've also got Marilyn Monroe was found dead.
Ah, yes, another great mystery.
Yeah, Patsy Cline died in a plane crash, 63.
Oh.
Beatlemania took root, so I think they played their first gig in the States, and I think that was the start of Beatlemania. And on the book front, we've got The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath was released.
Oh, wow, yeah.
And The Graduate by Charles Webb. And then at the end of 62, One Flew Over the Cuckoo Nest as well.
Wow.
So these are sort of Christie's contemporaries at the time. That's who she's selling books with.
It's kind of amazing to me with The Pale Horse and now with this, how she sort of like beatniks and the Beatles and Cold War paranoia spies all get filtered through Christie into sort of a beautiful suburban crescent, and all the neighbours, middle class neighbours, curtain twitching and coming in for their sort of very sensible lunches. I mean, it's just all of this craziness. You can see it in the novel, but it's kind of been Christified into something, I don't know, safer maybe and easier to digest.
Yeah, well, she's definitely viewing it through her lens, isn't she? But like, she is definitely documenting all these things as well.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, let's get into the characters, and we'll start off with the various detectives, because there are a lot in this. So we have Inspector Dick Hardcastle, who is the investigating officer. We have Sergeant Cray, who's a more junior policeman in the case. We have Colin Lamb, a British intelligence agent, hinted to be a son of Superintendent Battlelate of these shores. If you remember the Seven Dials mystery. Here's a quotation about him. "It's not the exciting job that people think it is," I said. "As a matter of fact, it's usually remarkably tedious. But there's something beyond that. Nowadays, one gets to feeling that nothing really is secret. We know their secrets and they know our secrets. Our agents are often their agents too. And their agents are very often our agents. And in the end, who is double-crossing who becomes a kind of nightmare. Sometimes I think that everybody knows everybody else's secrets." And this is very kind of like in the vein of John le Carré and Spy Who Came In From the Cold. And I just think this is, in this sort of safe Agatha Christie environment, she's absolutely on the money with what's going on with Kim Philby and everything that's going on.
She's definitely got this this atmosphere of the 60s, this schizophrenic atmosphere of the 60s that you see in a lot of detective novels, and detective novels, spy novels of the period. And as I was reading this as well, I was thinking, like, this is not James Bond that she's writing about now. This is the much less glamorous side of the intelligence agency. This is much more Len Dayton's Harry Palmer, or, as you were saying, John le Carré's. It's a much grittier, sort of less glamorous version.
This is the world of
the
slow
spy.
horses, isn't it? This is not James Bond, which I really love. And it's worth saying to the listener, if you haven't read the book yet, that Colin Lamb is basically the protagonist. He's kind of the hero, as much, if not more so, than Hercule Poirot. And he has a spy master called Colonel Beck. And that this is what he says to Colin. "You may have got something there," said Colonel Beck. "There are times when I suspect you, Colin, of having changed over to the other side. There are times when I suspect myself of having changed over to the other side, and then having changed back again to this one. All a jolly mix-up." But there's a truth in there, isn't there? It reminded me a little bit of that TV show Chernobyl, when the head of the KGB is saying, "You're being followed, I'm being followed at this very moment, and that person there's being followed too. This is how we keep each other." I mean, it was just this wonderful, webs within a web within a web. So I think she definitely gets that kind of bleakly comic, sort of shadowy world of the spies. And then last but not least, we do get Hercule Poirot, renowned Belgian detective. But, he is definitely on the downslope of his fame, apparently. So here's a little exchange. "What's his name?" "Hercule Poirot." "I've heard of him. I thought he was dead." "He's not dead, but I have a feeling he's bored. That's worse." So the younger generation are like, we sometimes do that, don't we? When someone will mention something like, "Oh, I thought they died years ago." Poor Poirot.
Definitely. But I found Poirot's brief moments in the book much more entertaining than those of poor Colin Lamb, because I just
for
find him
sure.
such a shallow character. So he's so poorly sort of characterized. He was quite disappointing, really, to read. Whereas, like, we've got our I don't know, you were probably going to get to it, but I'm going to try and steal your thunder. We've got our Poirot being Poirot for Xander moments,
Oh,
haven't
go
we?
for it. You go for it then.
There's this great bit where Poirot says, "I am modest, but one does not need a rapier to cut through the string of a parcel." And he's talking about how difficult it is solving this problem. So I thought that was fantastic.
Exactly.
And then Colin Lamb, in like seconds later, he said modesty was not his strong point. But I guess for some time he had no one much to talk to and was enjoying the sound of his own voice.
So horrible, so catty.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of like mocking the character of Poirot, but also mocking the whole exercise of writing detective fiction, which I find lovely in this.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think, like, it isn't one of the best, but there is some really funny stuff. So this is at the point at which Poirot is reading different types of detective fiction, and this is what he says about his friend Ariadne Oliver. I think I do not wholly approve of her works, mind you. The happenings in them are highly improbable. The long arm of coincidence is far too freely employed. And being young at the time, she was foolish enough to make her detective a Finn. And it's clear that she knows nothing about Finns or Finland, except possibly the works of Sibelius.
Yeah, that's brilliant, because I just, when I read that, I just thought this is a meta commentary, isn't it, by Agatha on all her fans or readers who probably criticised the fact that Poirot's Belgian, and all the letters that she's had off people saying, Belgians aren't like this. What do you mean? So she's obviously just making the same point, isn't she? So I thought it was quite good.
Yeah, and this is Poirot on Arthur Conan Doyle. Presumably, this is also Agatha's own attitude, and I have to say it's one I completely and utterly share. These tales of Sherlock Holmes are in reality far-fetched, full of fallacies, and most artificially contrived. But the art of the writing, that is entirely different. The pleasure of the language, the creation, above all, of that magnificent character, Dr. Watson. That was indeed a triumph. And then he goes on about his Sir Cher Hastings and how absurd it was for him to rush off to South America and abandon him. So all very good, I think. And actually, if you want to know about the other people that are described as detective fiction writers, the All About Agatha podcast really goes into trying to identify who she's talking about, all of them. Any other comments on the detectives, Pat?
No, not anything else to add to them. No.
Okay, well, let's go to the Secretarial Bureau, this very new and enterprising invention for this novel. So first of all, we have Miss Catherine Martindale, who owns the Cavendish Secretarial Bureau. She's the sister of Valerie Bland, and she's nicknamed Sandy Cat by the typists. Any comments on her?
Not really. In that, like, obviously she's a self-made, strong-willed woman, so she's obviously, like, I would say, a marker of the change in British society. I think it's quite interesting. Like, she is always watching her time. She's like having to be on it, and you're thinking, well, this is just the epitome of a self-made person. She's marking when people are 4 minutes late back off the lunch. It's like, yeah, it's okay for you to take those 4 minutes because I'm paying you for them. And things like that. And I thought, like, it was quite on the money, that.
Yeah, absolutely. Shrewd woman. And then there's Sheila Webb, who really sets events in motions because she is one of the secretaries who works for Catherine Martindale. And someone rings up the Secretarial Bureau and specifically asks for her to go round to the house in Wilbraham Crescent, owned by the blind lady, at a certain time to do some typing. And when she gets there, she's the person who finds the body of the dead man. So she's obviously of great interest, and at first, because she's found with a dead man, rushes out screaming and straight into Colin Webb. So that sort of sets events in motion. She has an aunt called Mrs. Lawton who raised her from infancy. And actually we get some, I guess, quite unpleasant but very typical now Agatha Christie stuff. She really has no sympathy for women who give up their children and for Sheila's mum. So this is how it's described. Slight as the reference to the sister had been, Hardcastle got an impression of a forceful, bitter, angry personality. The sort of woman who was determined not to have her life blasted by one mistake. In a cold, hard-headed way, she had provided for the upkeep and presumable happiness of her child. From that moment on, she had cut herself adrift to start a new life again on her own. So quite damning, that, I think.
Yeah, I think that's probably, again, coming back to this sort of like marking social change and marking society's attitudes and the regressive, progressive side of things. Like, there's obviously still an element of social stigma around children, born out of wedlock. And you do see them talking about this, like the younger characters seem to be less hung up on it, but it does seem to be something that the older generation in this book worry about. It's something that concerns them. And I do think Christie captures that quite well. I don't know whether it's her opinion or not, but like, there's throughout all the characters in Wilbraham Crescent that you do get this small-minded bigotry. You see, like, stuff being dropped in about Johnny Foreigner and
okay.
I wouldn't want a foreign doctor to look after me and things like that, and it's still there all the way through. So
yeah. And then the final sort of secretarial bureau related person is Edna Brent, who's another typist, friend of Sheila Webb's. This is how Mrs. Lawton, so Sheila's aunt, describes Edna Brent. I mean, they work in the same office and all that, but she's rather a dull girl, not very bright, and she and Sheila aren't particular friends. Poor Edna. Any comments on the characters in the secretarial bureau?
they're really just quite thin plot devices. I mean, even Sheila, who is
Bit of
given
a
quite a prominent
non-entity.
role.
Yeah.
Apart from the owner, Catherine Martindale, who I think is obviously quite an intelligent, and driven woman. I think there's not really much to say about the rest of them. They're really just plot devices. They just move things along. So.
Yeah, I think it's kind of weird actually, because even Colin Lamb I find a little bit thin. It's weird, isn't it? These two people who actually were sort of meant to believe in as a potential love story even aren't that well written.
Yeah, the romance of it is not well written at all, really. I think this book has other strengths.
Yeah, we don't root for them. But let's get to Wilbraham Crescent and the occupants therein, because I think that's where Agatha Christie was focusing her imaginative creativity, especially with our cat lady. So let's start with Miss Millicent Pebmarch, the blind teacher, inhabitant of 19 Wilbraham Crescent, where the crime is committed. I actually thought this was quite a cool portrait because she is very independent. She goes to work. She's got her routine. She lives independently. And I thought, you know what? Considering how decades earlier Agatha Christie might have portrayed differently abled people, I thought this was quite a cool character. What do you think?
Yes, Mrs. Pedmarsh or Miss Pedmarsh has a lot of, a lot of traits that you would admire. Like she's somebody who's lost her sight, so she was a school teacher, but she's adapted. She's created a new career for herself. Even though she's blind. I can't remember. Is she teaching Braille or she's teaching blind children to read, something like that? But she's made a career for herself despite being.
She works in a photographer studio as well, so she's she is out and about. It's pretty cool.
And all the neighbours have a degree of admiration for her. They're all like, oh well, you wouldn't think she was blind the way she gets around, and she's, nothing stops her, and she does this and she's doing that, and she's always bringing in her own groceries and things like that. So she's obviously like a very sort of driven, motivated individual, even though she is quite advanced in her years as well. So I think she's definitely somebody who I think we're meant to admire her achievements. So.
I agree. She's a cool character. Okay, then let's move on to the Waterhouses, occupants of number 18 Wilbraham Crescent. So there's James Waterhouse and his sister Edith, who comes armed with a golf club. Any comments on the Waterhouses?
A little bit of affection for them in that they were obviously there for a bit of comedy. We've got James, who's a solicitor, who hides from his sister at the local club where he has like these long lunches and stuff like that. And Edith, who runs his house and tells him what to do the rest of the time. And like you said, has reached for the golf clubs. She's probably using them rather than, she probably golfs every weekend rather than her brother. And she's got one to hand, I can't remember who is it who notices it. Is it one of the detectives who notices it, or is it even Poirot who says, I can see you've got that to hand, probably for self-defense. And she's going, I don't know how that got there. No idea.
One of a long line of annoyingly nagging, controlling sisters who live with their professional brothers, going back as long as the murder of Roger Ackroyd. So very familiar Christie-esque character, I think. 20 Wilbraham Crescent is Mrs. Hemming, the aforementioned, the cat lady, who I think is just hilarious. And I love this chapter. You get the impression that Agatha knows this woman, and God bless cat ladies everywhere as we come into this election season. But I really love Mrs. Hemming. And this is one of the reasons why I don't think this is, bottom 10% Agatha Christie, because this is just delightful, this portrait, I feel.
Yeah. And like I said, I think it's probably the first time I've read, or it's not the first time I've read about a crazy cat lady or seen this stereotype in drama. But I think historically, if you go back chronologically, I'm not sure people have written about crazy cat ladies to this extent before. So it comes back to the progressive sort of thing. I'm wondering, is this something that Agatha has noticed in British society? Like, after the war, do we have a generation of women who were maybe widowed, or who never got married because their husband, like, so many young men were killed at war.
Probably
That
makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? Yeah.
they've grown older and they've just taken on a load of cats. And so we now have that sort of like that character in British society. Maybe I'm overanalyzing it. Maybe Double P Media will be on the VOT comments again, going, Pat, you're being too serious. But anyway, I like thought
that.
it was quite
and we
interesting.
can continue this. We can continue being serious about social change, because I believe that at number 61 Wilbraham Crescent, we've got Josiah Bland, who's a builder.
And not just any old builder, a cowboy builder.
made his money in post-war slum landlording, and this was a huge thing in London that had been bombed out after the war, and people putting up really shoddy housing, and then extortion of poor tenants. And if you read the real life cases of the Rackmans, of the Barclays brothers, lots of people who became kind of famous because they were done for fraud in the 80s have their roots and their fortunes. Actually, Michael Heseltine, the Tory MP, had sort of his, I think, family made their money in slum landlording. It was a very common thing, and some of those really great post-war films, especially the more sinister ones, things like Peeping Tom, will have be set in that environment. So I think it's very on the nose and very kind of acutely observed from Agatha to have this kind of a character. And he has his wife Valerie, but here's what Hardcastle says of him. He's a very bad builder, uses pretty poor materials, puts up the kind of houses that look more or less all right until you live in them. Then everything falls down or goes wrong. Sells fairly near the wind sometimes. Sharp practice, but manages to get away with it. Anything to say about the Blands?
Yeah, just like I said, the cowboy builder aspect. You had you've analysed it probably a lot more accurately than I had. Again, I just superficially looked at it almost like a comedy statement. I'd not even taken on board the sort of like the sort of like the social impact of what these people were doing in post-war Britain.
It was a huge thing in that era. Just quality of build. We're still living with the impact of it today when you look at some of the big sort of cities in London, in England, and the sort of the quality of what was put up, and still dealing with it because it still exists. I'm saying it doesn't exist even now in contemporary society, but it was a huge thing, and people were just figuring it out, and very linked with organized crime. So if you're a big fan of East London gangsters who made their money in West London slums, a huge thing. Okay, we're now going to get criticised for being way too serious. Okay, on to 62 Wilbraham Crescent. We have Mrs. Ramsey. She has a husband who frequently travels abroad. She's got a son, or they've got a son called Bill, who's 11 years old. And then there's Ted Ramsey, the younger son. Also, they're both home from school, boarding school for the holidays. And there's a wonderful description about boarding school mums that says, nothing is happier than the first day when they come home in the anticipation of seeing the kids again. And then you get into the second week and it's just like, oh my God, please can they just go away again?
They go back again.
And, Agatha Christie had a famously interesting relationship with being maternal, and probably felt very much the same about sending her daughter to and from school. But there we go. Anything to say about that family?
We should maybe leave it until the spoilers.
Yeah,
but I do think, again, there's a lot of admiration from the other characters in Wilbraham Crescent towards Mrs. Ramsey, who's handling these two boys to the best of her ability and struggling. Fascinated by catapults and playing tricks on the neighbours and spaceships and things like that. I think maybe that's another comment on sort of like social change again. Children are now playing with spaceships.
Everyone's obsessed with space.
Yeah. Everybody's becoming obsessed with space. So
I do love how Agatha Christie characters can be very honest about what it is to be a woman and a mother in a way that others aren't. And I've just reread the Elena Ferrante Neapolitan Quartet, which was written, I guess, 10 years ago now. And everyone's like, oh my God, it's the first person to say that sometimes mothers don't like their kids and it's so hard. And and I was like, well, Agatha Christie was doing this. There are people who've been honest about what womanhood is decades earlier. And I think she's to be applauded for that.
Definitely.
Okay, let's get into 63 Wilbraham Crescent, occupied by Angus MacNaughton, a retired professor, Mrs. MacNaughton, his wife, and Gretel, the MacNaughton's Danish girl / au pair.
I think you pretty much covered that. The thing I would add, Gretel and Ingrid. Again, we've got like foreign au pairs
Yeah, that's a
who
new
are
thing.
in.
We've not heard of that
Yeah,
before, have we? Yeah.
yeah, but again, they're introduced for comedy value, and I was a little bit disappointed in Agatha here, but like I can see why she's done it. Like they're like in both houses, it seems like the au pairs can never serve a meal on time. They just do it
Yeah.
whenever they feel like it. So
And one suspects very strongly that this is Agatha venting about maybe an experience she's had
yeah,
with an au
yeah,
pair. And then we have in the final house, 19 Wilbraham Crescent, Geraldine Brown, a young girl living, across from 19 Wilbraham Crescent. And as you said, echoes of Rear Window. It also gave me a little bit Crooked House vibes, the spooky little
yeah.
girl who observes everything. And
Yeah, but I did think she was quite an engaging character. I enjoyed the conversation and the
yeah,
dialogue between
she's
her and
very smart. She's
yeah,
very smart. As was the girl in Crooked House. I mean, to be
yeah,
admired in some respects. And yeah, she's the one with Ingrid, the Norwegian au pair, but all au pairs are the same, sort of slightly incompetent and Nordic, apparently.
yeah.
Anything else to say about the characters? Maybe
The
we'll
only
come
other
back.
one we've
Oh,
got to
sorry.
mention is Melina Rival.
Oh,
Should
of
have the
course.
actress klaxon going off. So
Yes, yes, yes. Yes, actress Claxon indeed. So progressive or regressive? You already mentioned the au pair girl. So here's the little bit of text relating to that. Quote, you ought to have one of those foreign girls, he said. Au pair, don't they call it? Come and do chores here in return for learning English. I suppose I might try something of that kind, said Mrs. Ramsay, considering. Though I always feel that foreigners may be difficult. My husband laughs at me, but then of course he knows more about this than I do. I haven't travelled abroad as much as he has. Hilarious. Um, this is Mrs. Bland. I'm fond of travel, but I wouldn't care to live outside of England. We've got all our friends here. Yeah, there's a lot of I don't think this is Agatha. I think this is Agatha just pointing out the narrow-mindedness of the typical
yeah,
British middle-class person at the
yeah.
time.
Reflecting British attitudes at the time. These are probably all phrases, and conversations that she's eavesdropped on.
Yeah, exactly. And
During the
she
normal
of
course
course
of life.
was very cosmopolitan and traveled a lot. So she's
Yeah.
probably just cringing and wincing whenever she hears all this. Okay, so let's do reviews and adaptations before we get into the spoiler section. So reviews. It was reviewed in The Guardian, so by someone called Francis Isles. He said, about Miss Agatha Christie's The Clocks, I'm not so sure. This begins well with the discovery of a stranger in a suburban sitting room with 4 strange clocks all showing the same time. But thereafter, the story, though as readable as ever, does tend to hang fire. And there is one very corny item, the vital witness killed when on the point of disclosing crucial information, which is quite unworthy of Mrs. Christie. And I kind of agree with that, I have to say. I didn't like that little plot thing.
Yeah, well, we can disagree about that in the spoiler section. I thought that was quite good. That.
Oh, okay.
So,
Interesting. All right. And let's get into the adaptation, singular. So is this one that you've seen?
yes, I did my homework this time, Bina.
Ah,
So
excellent.
I watched that. I enjoyed it. I think I enjoyed it more than the book. I quite liked Phil Daniels as one of the detectives. I thought he quite a few good lines where he was trying to one up Poirot. So that was quite entertaining. And I think Tom Burke did quite a good job as Colin Race rather than
I
Colin Lamb.
know. Why did they make him Colin Race? But I love Tom Burke, so I was very happy to see him in this. Young
Yeah.
Jamie Winston in there as well.
And I think, like, if we were to compare this with some of the other adaptations that they've done from the sort of the post-war period, but which they've transplanted back into the 30s, I actually think the spy element of this works quite well.
Really? Because that's
Yeah,
the bit I
setting it with the
didn't
Nazis.
like. Oh my goodness. Okay.
Okay, all right. Well, again, it's something we can discuss in the spoilers, but I thought it worked. I thought it was quite ham-fisted when they did Taken by the Flood, but on this one, I thought, yeah, I liked it. I liked how it worked. I thought I can see why they did it now by setting it in the 30s, because it almost becomes unbelievable that Poirot has been operating, and he was semi-retired when he started, for nearly 40 years. So, like, he must be like in his 80s.
Yeah.
If we're to sit down and take this at sort of like face value. Now, at the very earliest. So it becomes more believable to set it in the 30s, I think, from an age point of view. So.
Yeah. So we're discussing the ITV adaptation, which is part of the David Suchet Hercule Poirot series. It's worth saying that this was one that was done later on. I think it's mostly famous, actually, because it's Anna Massey, who was this amazing British TV, stage, film actress. It was her last role. She plays Miss Pedmarch and just has such authority and gravitas. It's lovely to see her. It does have Tom Burke. I think he's really good in it. I actually really like it on its own terms, I guess. I think it because they have to put it in the 30s, that then does change a lot of the spy elements because it's not Cold War, which I kind of like. And then they gave Colin Race a bit of sort of pre-story where he had let down the love of his life when left her in danger, and now he's got to make up for it. But I think what they're trying to do with a lot of the changes they make is to kind of improve upon some of the plotting, so I don't really blame them for it. I think it's perfectly watchable. It's just not as close to the novel, but maybe that's a good thing if you don't like the novel. I don't know. But yeah, it sounds like, as with the book, I'm okay on it, but not as positive as you. So you're more in the medium for both of them, and I'm a bit sort of lower medium, I guess, in my rating, maybe. All right, then. Well, we shall leave it there for the spoiler-free part of this episode. Join us after the end credits music for the solution and the clues to this novel. And join us in the next episode for Caribbean Mystery, a Miss Marple novel. Okay, folks, we're back. And why don't you go first and just say, in general, how satisfying or not do you find the resolution of the novel? Because I think you seem to like the plotting probably more than me and probably more than most.
Well, you might be a more objective reviewer of this. You may be giving a better sort of summary or critique of it than I will, because I found the first half of this book very difficult reading. It never really grabbed me. I never really appreciated it because I found it quite dry. I mean, after like the first paragraph, which was quite good, the rest of it was a bit of a plod, because this isn't a very glamorous period. I mean, one of the things that I enjoy about Christie's is when she's writing about the glamour of the 20s and the 30s, and the people that she's got. There is almost like an element of, I don't know, charisma and elegance and almost decadence in some of the stuff that you enjoy reading about, because it's quite engaging, quite exciting, all the stuff that's going on. Whereas this is quite drab and dreary, and it, like we've talked about it in respect of the sort of the spy stories, like it's James Bond and Len Dayton, and like one is just a lot less glamorous than the other. But the one thing that hooked me was like just towards the end, where Colin Lamb realizes that he's made a mistake because the bit of paper he's been looking at was put upside down. So it's when he twigs that Miss Pedmarsh is the spy that he's been chasing. And it was when that penny dropped, I thought, hang on, I've missed an awful lot of quite clever clues that Agatha's dropped here because I've not been paying attention. So I went back and did it again. And I just had got a new appreciation for it. So like the little things in the cluing that I thought she'd been really clever with. And I thought, I've not been fair, because I don't tend to read Christie's for the puzzle element. And I do think that if you like the puzzle books, this is a good one, because like there's like the timing of the phone calls right at the very start I never picked up on, but it's there plain as day, and it sort of ties into what you were saying about Edna being bumped off and it being a bit ham-fisted. But I thought actually what that was doing was it was drawing attention to the fact that you should be looking for the clue in respect of the timing, because like right at the very start,
it's called the clocks.
we're told that what's her name, the head of the secretarial college, he takes the phone call at 2:30, but like that she tells all the detectives that it came in at like 10:50, and and suddenly Edna's clocked it.
Yeah.
So I feel that it draws our attention to it. And I'm quite simple, really. I just thought Agatha's obviously seen the resemblance between 61 and 19 and thought somebody would get those confused, and I can write a book about that. And I thought,
yeah,
well done, hats off. So
I agree with you, actually. I think the plotting is good in general, and I think it is a good puzzle mystery, even though the characters are a bit weaker. I just think that to find not one but two spies on the same street was a bit much for me, even though it's the height of the Cold War.
yeah,
So that's why I knock it down. But yeah, I think as a puzzle mystery, I think it works really well, and it's probably one of the better ones of
yeah.
Poirot for a while.
You almost feel a little bit sorry for Mr. Bland as well, and the
Yeah.
sister-in-law who planned out this murder. Like, what are the chances that they just managed to try and frame a Russian spy at the same time?
Yeah,
You
and
know, so
also
that
to
is like
have a sort of an MI6 officer on the street who happens to
yeah,
be mates with Hercule Poirot.
yeah, it's
Damn you
like a
pesky
massive
kids. If it weren't for you, I would have gotten away for it. It's very
yeah.
Scooby-Doo. Anyway, let's give the solution to the listener. So we hope you've, by the way, read this by now if you're in this section. But if you haven't, this is a classic thing that we've had a few times now in Agatha Christie, where a marriage is not all it's purported to be. So the present Mrs. Bland is actually the second Mrs. Bland. Mr. Bland married in the war, but his wife was killed overseas in that same war. He remarried soon after another Canadian woman. The Canadian family, meanwhile, of his first wife had disapproved of him, cut off communication with their daughter so thoroughly that they didn't know she was dead. So some 16 years later, the first wife was heiress to an overseas fortune, thought to be the last living relative. When the news of that fortune reaches the Blands, they decided that the second Mrs. Bland has to now pose as a Canadian heiress who has now mysteriously lost a Canadian accent because she's been living in England so long. And Claxon is an actress. That should raise our suspicions anyway. To get the money rather than admit that, first Mrs. Bland was dead and they don't have the money. So they succeed in fooling the British law firm that was looking for the heir on behalf of the Canadian firm handling the will. But, and this is very similar to, oh my goodness, what's the Agatha Christie with Hercule Poirot and Ariadne Oliver at the Village Fete where they plan the murder mystery called, total brain fart.
Dead Man's Folly.
Dead Man's Folly. This is basically a little bit the same plot. So they would have got away with it if it weren't for you pesky kids, except that Quentin Duguesclin, who knew the first wife and her family, decides to look her up in England more than a year later. So somehow you have to get rid of the person who could identify the body, or not identify the body, identify that this first wife is no longer actually the wife. So basically, they need to murder him. So the fact that it becomes this whole thing with clocks and blah, 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 and this whole outlandish way of murdering him is a bit of a red herring. And it's taken from an unpublished mystery story whose author had been a client of Miss Martindale, who runs the secretarial agency. And she's actually the literary executor of this famous detective novelist. So she's got unpublished manuscripts. So hence the whole thing of Poirot talking about different authors is relevant. And she just happens to be the person who runs the secretarial agency, just happens to be the sister of the second Mrs. Bland. So everything else that happens in this novel is basically a red herring or a side plot or a distraction. The real plot is basically very classic Agatha Christie, where you have a couple who we don't realize are a couple or aren't the right couple or aren't really married, and there's a bunch of money involved, and they're just having to murder someone to cover up the fact that they lied to get the money, which is actually a very classic Christie, right?
Yeah.
And then we have all the red herrings and distractions. So Mr. Ramsay has defected. He is a Philby and McLean, and his wife knew he was going to. So it's very, very McLean. Wonder if she'll go and join him later.
Well,
Mr.
no, she definitely makes this statement in the book, doesn't she? That she is not going to go. She's going to
Good for
stay
her,
behind for the
'cause it's
kids
really,
because she's not sure what sort of upbringing the children will get over in
in the
Russia.
Soviet. Yeah, exactly.
Again, like bringing this back to the progressive and the regressive side of things, like this was like whether we think it was right or wrong or whatever, regardless of your political opinions, there was definitely a feeling running through British society that like middle class British children were much better off being brought up in Britain than anywhere else in the world, because they got opportunities like playing cricket and things like that that just weren't available. Like there was a court case I remember reading about, like, so Denning, like the famous sort of judge back in like the 70s, was given a paternity case, not a paternity case, a custody case for two young boys, and the mother was French and the father was British. but it was being heard in the British court, and like the presumption was that the children would always go with the mother, but completely flying in the face of all legal precedent. Denning made a speech about the benefits of a British education and the chance to play cricket, and awarded custody to the father. And I was reminded of that when I read that Mrs. Ramsey had decided that she wanted to stay in the UK, and so she wasn't going to go and flee to the Soviet Union with her husband.
Good for her. Is it Kim Philby or Guy Burgess? I think it's Philby. He used to get copies of the Times sent to him in Moscow so he could keep up with the county cricket scores.
I didn't know that. No.
Absolutely. You can take maybe a communist, but he still loves his cricket.
Yeah.
So that's one little sort of bit of red herring-y mystery on the street. So there's now not one but two communist spies on the street. Mr. McNaughton resigned his university chair because his wife's an alcoholic, so he's covering up and being mysterious for that, which is actually rather sweet and lovely, I think. And then Flossie Gap was paid to give the confirmation that her dead husband had a scar behind his ear and was killed for complaining about being made an accessory. Poor Flossie Gap. Now to the real stuff. The murder sounds like a Gregson murder mystery. Fantastical. And Miss Martindale not only typed up his manuscripts, but helped edit his work. So that should give you the clue that the setup for the murder is so ridiculous that should give you a clue that maybe it is ridiculous, and it's like one of the ridiculous murder mysteries that Poirot has been describing. The second clue, why did Edna want to consult Sheila away from the office? Because the she was referring to was Miss Martindale. Miss Martindale didn't know that Edna had come back early from lunch because of a broken shoe, and so knows that no call came through from Miss Pedmarsh ordering Sheila well. So that's the first real clue that the head of the secretarial school company is involved. Mrs. Bland had mentioned liking living in Crowdean near a sister, so we know she's got a sister, so then you can start linking the two sisters together. Yes, shades of Dead Man's Folly and indeed Taken at the Flood in the plotting. Mr. Bland's day trip to Bologna was to discard the visitors' papers, so basically the dead man's papers, dump them in the sea. Anything else? The drugged body was delivered to Miss Pedmarsh in a laundry bag, and that van, and that is what Geraldine sees in her rear window. Bit of cluing. That's a good clue. And last but not least, and this is another thing, so I couldn't get my head around the fact that there were not one but two Soviet spies on the street. And then I couldn't get my head around the fact that Miss Pedmarsh turns out to be Sheila Webb's mum, given up to be a spy. That's the bit when I really was like, okay, I might have put this mid-tier, but now this is like definitely lower mid-tier because that's a bit silly.
Well, yeah, but I think it was also maybe I read it slightly differently from you because it was silly and the coincidences do stretch, credibility. But I did think at the time Christie was saying something about being a mother because Mrs. Pedmarsh had still stayed local, and was obviously keeping an eye on her daughter. She was interested in how her daughter was doing, even though she was also seriously committed to her cause. And I do think as well, Christie was saying something about the mood in Britain at the time, about how terrified people were of communism and the fanatics that it created, because Christie was saying, well, that here's a mother who's given it up for a cause that is a threat. It's an existential threat to our existence, So I find that interesting.
Is he to be blamed for sort of putting fuel on the fire? Because if people all think there are Reds under the bed, and then you write a mainstream popular novel with two Reds under the bed in the same sort of street,
and one of them has given up a child for the cause,
and that one is also given a chance to escape. I mean, there's a very famous incident where Philby was best mates from school really with this guy called Nicholas Elliott, who ended up being very senior in MI5, and they met when everyone knew, well, the establishment knew that Philby was a spy, and he was inconvenient because by this time Burgess and McLean are in Moscow. And he goes to meet him in Beirut, and they have this conversation, which is taped, but there's 2 minutes where they go out onto the terrace, and that is not taped. And what is thought has happened is that Nicholas Elliott offers Philby a way out and says, look, defect. Because for the British establishment, it was almost less embarrassing for him to just go to Moscow than to have to try him. And that's kind of what happens here, right? So I wonder if that was why, I don't think that was widely known at the time, but maybe Agatha Christie knew about it. Maybe it's just imagination, where you have this exchange where Miss Pedmarsh says, "I'm not taking advantage of your offer. What would be the use? I shall stay here until they come. There are always opportunities, even in prison, of indoctrination, you mean, if you like to put it that way." We sat there hostile to each other, but without understanding. I just think it's sort of like, it's very, like, if you think Christie at 71 doesn't know exactly how the world is working at this exact moment of 1963, the fact that she absolutely gets this moment, I think, is phenomenal as someone who loves spy
Yeah,
fiction.
well, again, like maybe I've not been reading this the way that it was intended, because like when I read this, I read it for the podcast, and I'm almost thinking like, so I'm looking out for social attitudes because we're marking Britain's history through the 20th century. And I do think, like you said, she's probably adding fuel to the fire, but I think she's captured that paranoia perfectly.
For sure.
This is what people were worried about. Characters like Miss Pedmarsh, who is prepared to go to prison because it gives her a chance to carry on fighting for the cause and spreading
And I'm sure there were Pedmarshes around, right? I mean, it is a cute. You're right. And anyway, I just think this just shows at 71, Agatha Christie absolutely knows what's going on in this country and is showing it. You're right. I think it's just amazing social observation, and you just read that sort of that bit of those key dates we do at the start of the podcast, and you just think, oh my word, this is absolutely a product of its time.
So like I take a lot of the criticisms that people make about this book, about the coincidences on board, and it's hard to defend them, but I would say, by way of an explanation, I think Christie is trying to say something as well. By the use of these characters, she's got something to say. She's like expressing people's opinions at the time, and I thought that was interesting. It engaged me. So
you're right. Actually, maybe that is the best way to view these. Like, Agatha Christie doesn't do things lazily, so she's got two spies. She's making a point, and you're right. Okay, well, I have been partly convinced. I'm going to elevate this to middle to now in my head.
Fantastic. About where I've got it.
Influence over anyone, but for what it's worth, that's where I have been persuaded, Pat.
And what I would say about the red herrings as well, and I think coming back to defense of the adaptation with the Suchet adaptation, like, she does put an awful lot of red herrings in here, even for like the simple readers like me who aren't great with puzzle books. Like Colin Lamb is talking to Colonel Beck, and he's like, "Is there anybody foreign living in the street?" And he's going, "Well, there are a couple of foreign housekeepers." And you're going, "Yeah, they could be them." Like a Norwegian. It's possible. That's quite close to Russia. So you've got these red herrings, and then just on the adaptation, there's a bit at the start where Poirot is watching an Ariadne Oliver play, and it's about Ariadne Oliver's detective, and it's called The Red Herrings, but in Finnish or whatever it is. So like they give like lots of knowing little asides in it, which I thought was quite a nice touch, because this I do think this has got an awful lot of red herrings in it for a Christie. I don't like we've done a few of these now, in about the 30 or so Christies that I've read. There's maybe a handful of books that have got this many red herrings in.
In a way, I mean, maybe like the one that we love like desperately, which is Death on the Nile, has a similar amount, because I think sometimes when you have these massive casts, you kind of then have to create ambiguous behavior from people so that you have lots of suspects. And I mean, that has effects red herrings too, because I think it's the same thing. Like Wilbraham Crescent, in a sense, is a big old Nile ship, isn't it, going down the Nile?
I think that's a great comparison. I think it's a good way of putting this in its ranking of the Christies, because I do think that's where Death on the Nile is so much stronger, because a lot of those red herrings, for me, all those stories are engaging. All those little side hustles are engaging stories in themselves, and I followed them all. Whereas with this one, on the first read, I didn't really engage with a lot of it. I sort of flicked it. It was like, oh yeah, crazy cat lady. Oh yeah, okay. Intelligent, observant, young teenage girl. Oh yeah. Cowboy builder. Clicking through it. So I didn't really appreciate it until I thought, with the, like I said, the 6119 thing. It's so simple, and maybe I'm just
so elegant,
simple person. But I thought, that's such a clever thing. I haven't been given this book its dues. I need to go back and do it again.
I agree with you. The central conceit is so simple and so elegant. and confidence. I think it's beautiful.
And
all right,
even with
I'm
the
really
clock,
glad we did a full podcast on this now.
yeah. No, I was going to say, and just even with the clocks as well, I just like that touch where Poirot, when he's explaining how it's all been done, and everybody's going, well, what about the clocks? And he's going, we just put in there to make it confusing, to add an extra element of complexity to it that shouldn't have been there, And that comes back to that quote on Poirot being Poirot. You don't need a rapier to open this parcel. It's quite straightforward. So I enjoyed it from that part, but I would say more on reflection rather than on my initial read.
Yeah, it's not as much fun to read, is it? It's a bit of a slog. Yeah. It does have these moments that are just so fun and so brilliant.
Yeah.
Oh, well,
so anyway,
on that lovely and happy note, I gather you didn't get on well with Caribbean Mystery, so that will be a mini pod next time.
Unless Hannah steps in.
And we'll see whether you do or don't like at Bertram's Hotel and whether that deserves a full episode. But
yes, well, yeah, I'll give it a go. I've seen The Mortal. It was a while ago, and I think I quite enjoyed it. So I think it's got quite a good cast, that one.
Yeah, and I think it's a great story, actually. It's and again, for social change, it is absolutely on the money. And I think it does, we mentioned the Great Train Robbery as one of the events. I think this is another one where Miss Marple's absolutely whether consciously or subconsciously, just taking in all these big news events and sort of putting them into her work, which is fantastic.
Yeah. Yes, fantastic. Right, well, thank you very much, Bina. It's been
You're very welcome.
fun.
Thanks for jumping on.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
Okay. And listeners, in fact, do feel free to join us on the Discord and continue the discussion, or leave a comment on the YouTube video.
Yes, I look forward to reading them. I'm always entertained.
Excellent. Goodbye, everyone.
Okay, thanks, Bina. Bye.
Bye.